Good afternoon. I'm Geoffrey Klass, CEO of Sense Diagnostics, and we have developed technology which allows us to detect, measure, and monitor neurological disorder in the brain real-time and non-invasively. The first application of the technology is going to be for stroke and traumatic brain injury patients. Any neurologist or neurosurgeon or emergency medicine doc is going to tell you time is brain. So when somebody is suffering from this, every minute of delay, millions of brain cells are going to die on this patient forever. So getting these patients to the proper hospital for treatment as quickly as possible is absolutely critical. But one of the real problems we have today, there is really no way for EMTs and paramedics to truly assess what's going on in a patient's brain when they come upon them. It's all very subjective. They'll look in their eyes, they'll have move their arms, it's called a Glasgow Coma Scale, and they'll assign a number to that, and from that they'll say, you have a stroke. But nobody really looked inside that patient's brain. So that patient can be delivered to the wrong hospital and not receive the kind of treatment that they need. There's 1.5 million strokes a year in the US and the EU. 60% of these people are either going to die or they're going to have permanent disability. And for those that have a traumatic brain injury, again, hundreds of thousands of people. So our solution, we have developed a non-invasive brain scanning device which is going to give us an immediate assessment of that patient's condition in real time. Now the device works like this, and this is the simple CEO description. There's 9 antennae in that headset. And these 9 antennae send and receive low power electromagnetic signals through the brain. Low power, like 1/500th that of a cell phone. And how these signals pass through the brain are going to change. And they'll change if it's going through normal brain matter to ischemic brain matter where there's been a loss of blood, or normal brain matter through a hemorrhage where there is obviously a lot of blood. But how these signal changes happen, and we are then able to calculate and measure exactly what's going on within that patient's brain and determine whether they're suffering from a small vessel occlusion, small vessel blockage, large vessel occlusion, or if they're having a hemorrhagic stroke. The device works really fast. In 40 seconds, there's going to be 720 passes through the brain. So we collect 720 data points. And we do analyze the entire cranial vault down into the brainstem. It's very important that you get down there. The other thing is we are very specific in what we can see. We can see as small as 1 milliliter of blood. That's basically the size of a pea. You can't even see that with a CT scan. Our sensitivity specificity was 100% in our first in human studies, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So we have one solution, but we're creating 2 devices with the same technology. The one device that we're creating is for field assessment, allowing EMTs and paramedics to basically effectively triage this patient when they come upon them. So they put the device on, and it's going to tell them a few things. It'll tell them whether they're having a stroke or not, which is very important, right? There's a lot of stroke mimics, more so than the number of strokes that they'll come upon. But then it's going to tell them what type of stroke that it is. Again, small vessel, large vessel, or hemorrhage. But from that, they can now make the decision of where do I need to take this patient, rather than taking them to the wrong hospital where they can't get treated and then have to get sent someplace else. Or they take people that don't need to be at stroke centers to the center and then blocking up the queue for the patients that really need to be there. The other device we have is for in-hospital use, and it's going to be used both in the ED, again, as an initial assessment of the patient when they're brought in so that we can determine who is having that large vessel occlusion or that hemorrhage. You get them in front of the line, you get them in a CAT scan, and you get them up in the angio suite for a procedure. And then we'll use it in the neuro ICU. And the problem there is when somebody's in the neuro ICU, there again is no objective way to measure if there's a hemorrhage expansion while they're there. So they still come in and they do the normal hourly Glasgow Coma Scale, very subjective, and then at about every 10 to 12 hours, they might take the patient down for another CAT scan. We're going to be able to monitor that patient and then alarm and the hospital personnel if there is a change in condition. So here's the use case for the field. If a patient is delivered to the right hospital at the right time within the first hour of the onset of their issue, their probability of returning to normal is very, very high. However, if this patient went to the wrong hospital, by the time they've gotten a CT and they've been evaluated and it's understood they're in the wrong place, on average, it's 5 hours later before they get to the right hospital. So a huge delay. This is a case study for in-hospital monitoring, and this is an actual patient from one of our first-in-human trials. In this case, the patient ended up in the neuro ICU. They had a hemorrhage of a 22 milliliter hemorrhage. We were monitoring. Unfortunately, we weren't able to alarm if the hemorrhage expanded. In this patient's case, we were following and we could see that hemorrhage expanding. At hour 2, it had expanded 3 milliliters. So unfortunately, as I said, we couldn't alarm. The hospital was still doing their normal assessment of the patient, and not until hour 7, when they took them down for a follow-up CAT scan, did they find that, in fact, this person had been bleeding. More detail on our first-in-human study. So we looked at 10 patients, but we had 600 hours of monitoring time on these patients. 3,600 scans were performed on them during this time. 100% sensitivity, 100% specificity. We were in 100% correspondence with the CT. Oh, and no false positives, no false negatives. This here shows you why it's really important to be able to manage and monitor the bleed that a patient is having. As I said, we can pick up that bleed at 1 milliliter. If it gets to 30 milliliters, your mortality rate has gone to 25%. When it goes from 30 to 60, you've gotten over a 90% mortality rate. The patient's chance of survival have gone almost completely. Only 20% of the survivors experience a full recovery within the first 6 months. 35 to over 50% of hemorrhage patients end up dying. And for every milliliter increase of that bleed, it's a 7% greater increase that they're going to have disability and end up in a nursing home. This we kind of put out there for the simple analogy of how we differ from our competition. Our technology allows us to look directly at what's going on in the patient's brain. Most of our competitors look at it indirectly. So we liken it to our competitors are trying to guess what boat is in a river by measuring the ripples on the shore. We're looking right at the boat. In this overview here, all the competition that we have out there is focused on making a field device. The problem that you have with the technology that they're using, most are just able to find a large vessel occlusion. They do a great job at that, but they're only finding a large vessel occlusion. You really need to be able to distinguish between all stroke types. The other thing is that none of them make a monitoring device, and none of them are able to filter out patient movement. So we're able to handle patient movement, and you can imagine there's a lot of that when you're getting a patient and putting them into the ambulance and then delivering them. So we're able to filter all of that out. And from a pricing standpoint, ours is very competitive, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but we've priced this thing so it effectively fits into the market. 7 million people within the US and the EU that have stroke or a traumatic brain injury. In hospital, we're going to sell that scanner for about $5,000 a piece. We're going to keep it under the CapEx process. The headset's going to be razor blade, $500 a piece for the headset. In the field, we don't exactly have the pricing yet because there's really a whole bunch of different customer classifications, but we know we're going to be able to drive an 85 to 95% or 90% margin on that. Where we stand right now, we have gotten approval for the FDA for our pivotal trial of our in-hospital monitoring device, 400-patient trial being led by Emory University. It'll be handled in 15 to 20 sites around the country. and we hope to get that completed in 9 to 12 months, and then we'll file 510(k) de novo with the FDA. We hope to be in market by the end of the second quarter of 21. A lot of support from NSF to get this going, and Cleveland Clinic is an early supporter of our device. Currently, we're raising $7 million. We're at $3 million, and moving on forward. But it's going to help us go through our study and get us into clinical. I'll finish up here with future applications. We had military as the future, but the future has become the present, and they have come to us in a very big way because we can solve a very big problem that they have. Other indications that we're going to be able to go after once we finish with stroke will be neurodegenerative, to be able to determine what's going on in the brain of those patients suffering from those diseases. So thank you for your time, and if anybody has any questions, I'll see you out after.